when Ben Affleck met Jennifer Garner on the set of the 2003 comic book Blockbuster. When is a superhero movie also a Valentine's Day appropriate love story? When that superhero movie is Mark Steven Johnson's Daredevil, which premiered in theaters 20 years ago on Feb. 14, 2003, a day generally reserved for more traditional cinematic romances. But the writer-director tells Yahoo Entertainment that the tragic romance between Marvel Comics' blind hero Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil, and hand-trained ninja Elektra played by Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner, respectively deliberately served as the beating heart of Daredevil's theatrical cut, which topped the Valentine's weekend box office and went on to gross over $100 million during its theatrical run. The love story became the primary story, Johnson says. Off-screen, of course, Daredevil inspired a real-life love story. Affleck and Garner were both in high-profile relationships when they played the doomed superhero couple. The Good Will Hunting Oscar winner was dating Jennifer Lopez, while the Alias star was married to Scott Foley but started dating a year after the film's release and walked down the aisle in July 2005. They separated a decade later in 2015 and share 3 children. In 2021, Affleck reconnected with Lopez and they were married last summer. Johnson declines to comment on his stars' real-world love lives, but says he has nothing but fond memories of filming their cinematic romance. It was a wonderful shoot, he recalls. We were on the rooftops of downtown LA. Or in New York City late at night, and it was just fun. It was its own world that you create around it. Even though there was a lot of pressure on me, as the director, there was an incredible on-set vibe. Johnson based much of Daredevil's love story on a classic Marvel Comics storyline penned by celebrated writer and artist, Frank Miller. And just like the comics, their romance ends in Elektra's temporary death at the hands of ace assassin, Bullseye, played by Colin Farrell in one of the Irish actor's looniest performances. That's a scene I'm particularly proud of, Johnson says now. It's really panel for panel out of Frank Miller's comic. Bullseye saying, "You're good, but I'm magic," and slashing Elektra's throat with a playing card, followed by her crawling on her hands and knees with blood coming out. In fact, there was a little too much blood for 20th Century Fox, the studio that released Daredevil and held onto the rights until 2013 when they reverted back to Marvel Studios. They were like, "It's pretty gruesome," Johnson says, laughing. I do remember getting some blowback on that, because her death was quite graphic. Some of the bloodier moments from Elektra's death scene were restored for Johnson's director's cut, which was released on home video in 2004 and remains his preferred version. It's definitely a more complete version, he says of that cut, which includes an entire storyline that was dropped from the theatrical version featuring the late rapper Coolio. Looking back on it, one of the mistakes I made with the film was wanting to put everything in. I wanted to do Daredevil's origin story, and I wanted to do the Elektra saga, and I wanted to introduce Bullseye and Foggy. I wanted everything to be in there, but the film could only support so much. And then when you're told to cut a half hour out and make it more of a love story, things start to feel rushed and not quite right. It's a fan thing. When you love something so much, you want to tell it all. In a spirited interview, Johnson, who went on to oversee the inaugural big screen appearance of another offbeat Marvel hero Ghost Rider, reveals some of the other actors he considered for the role of Daredevil and the fan blowback he received for changing the race of a major Marvel villain. Yeah, it was such a different world then. It's funny, we were developing Daredevil before the first Spider-Man came out, and I remember people saying to me, "I don't think that movie's gonna work." I was like, "Why? Spider-Man is one of the greatest characters." And they said, "Well, you can't see his face," laughs. I remember telling people I was going to do Daredevil and they would say to me, "You mean Evel Knievel?" I'd explain, "No, he's a blind lawyer who has superpowers and heightened senses, and he puts on a devil costume to fight crime." And they'd be like, "Oh, so it's a comedy." Nobody knew who the character was then, the Marvel catalog was so deep. And now everybody knows all the characters. It's pretty amazing how much has changed in 20 years. I have to imagine that the success of early Marvel movies like Blade and X-Men helped change things for you. Yeah, X-Men was the first one where people went, "Wow, you can take these movies seriously and do something interesting." That was the one that changed everything, it really was. For Daredevil, I was using inspiration from The Crow and Blade, and movies like that which I loved so much. The look of Daredevil is very stylized. You use a lot of Dutch angles and some intense colors. Did you feel more freedom as a director in terms of what you could get away with? There was so much pressure on me because I was still a new director, but as far as the actual content went, it was kind of the Wild West. Now, Marvel is so successful and so huge, it's their universe, and rightfully so. They control everything about their movies so successfully. But back then, no one quite knew what any of this was. and I would have my stack of comic books trying to show them. They would be like, he's not gonna actually have horns, right? He's called Daredevil because he does Daredevil things, but he's not going to dress up like a devil. That's ridiculous. You were fighting for everything. But you also got the chance, like we did, to show something different. Today people either love the movie or they hate it, but the one thing I think we did successfully was show the real life of a superhero. What would it be like if you had heightened senses and could hear people crying for help? What would it feel like if you're not Superman, so every night when you go to bed, you've got a ton of aches and pains and you're popping pain pills? All of that stuff was interesting to me. Certainly, Avi Arad, who was the head of Marvel back then, was all over the movie. And current Marvel Studios head, Kevin Feige, was a vice president then, and we spoke the same language. We were the nerds who grew up with the comics. The true believers. Kevin was always brilliant, and you could tell that he was going to be someone you could trust and go to with questions. He was great back then, and he's great now. I also met with former Marvel Comics boss, Joe Quesada, because his Daredevil run with Kevin Smith influenced my take. The first scene of the movie where he's draped over the cross, beaten and bloodied, was from their comics. I met with Frank Miller as well, and Frank's in the movie. He's the guy with the pen in his head. Side note. I'll never forget when we were shooting that scene, there was a huge snowstorm in New York and we had a long setup. So Frank said, "Let's get out of here," and we went around the corner to the White Horse Tavern, and then he still had the pen in his head with fake blood coming down. There I am, having a drink with Frank Miller in a bar, and because this was New York, people just looked at us and went, "Yeah, whatever." The characters tend to be the main attraction in contemporary comic book movies. When you made Daredevil, did the studio still expect you to cast movie star in the lead role? Yes, they definitely wanted a star because the character was so unknown and they felt it needed the help of a star. The budget was around $75 million, which was a good-sized budget back then. Thought by today's standards it's more like an independent film, so there was a lot of pressure, and they wanted a name. Guy Pearce has said that he turned down the role, and Matt Damon also passed on it as well. Did you meet with either of them? It was definitely one of those roles where everyone was being mentioned. There were a lot of people in the mix. I don't remember if I met with Guy, but I did meet with Edward Norton. I also remember Seth Rogen coming in to read for Foggy Nelson. Future Iron Man director, Jon Favreau, portrays the role of Matt's best friend and fellow lawyer in the film. He was so funny, and we loved him, but I was also like, dude, how old are you? He was probably 21 or 22 at the time, way too young to be a lawyer. I met with a couple of other actors, too, but Ben was a fan of Daredevil because of Kevin Smith, so it ended up being him. And then he became Batman. It's an interesting question, because he also played Superman in that George Reeves movie, Hollywoodland. I think he's attracted to the darker characters for sure, and he certainly has the physicality for it. Ben's a big dude. People forget that he's big and strong, and he's got that chin, too. He feels like a superhero, you know. That's how we present this content. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. For the support of our viewers, thank you.